I woke up to the sound of music. Not the soft kind that drifts through an open window on a summer morning, but full-blast, pounding music. The kind that makes your chest vibrate and your cat hide under the bed. My first thought was that someone had crashed onto my farm and brought a portable nightclub with them. I rubbed my eyes, thinking maybe I was dreaming, but the bass thumped harder, and the smell of food, way too fancy for my farm kitchen, wafted through the open window. Confused and a little terrified, I stepped outside. That's when I saw it, a sea of white tents, rows of chairs perfectly aligned, and hundreds of people milling around like ants at a picnic. Flowers in every corner, photographers snapping pictures, waiters running back and forth carrying trays of champagne. It was a wedding. A full-blown, magazine cover-worthy wedding. And it was on my property. I pinched myself, twice. Once for reality, once for sanity. The farm I'd spent years building, the one place I thought was mine, had become the venue for Karen's latest HOA stunt. Yes, Karen. The same HOA president who considered herself the queen of our suburban kingdom. The same woman who had personally lectured me about keeping up appearances when I let my grass grow a little taller than the HOA deemed acceptable. And now, apparently, she had decided my farm was perfect for a wedding, without asking me, without a single text, call, or knock on my door, just hers. I walked closer, trying to comprehend what I was seeing. A man in a tuxedo was pecking nervously near a giant floral arch that I had once thought would look nice as a photo backdrop for my pumpkin patch. Bridesmaids in pastel dresses giggled near my barn doors, totally unaware that they were stepping on what, yesterday, was my freshly plowed field. A flower girl ran past, scattering petals across the hay bales I'd stacked for my livestock. And there she was, Karen, standing proudly at the center of it all, arms crossed, sunglasses perched on her perfectly coiffed hair, smiling like she'd just won some sort of HOA Super Bowl. She looked up at me and without missing a beat said, "Good morning. Isn't this a beautiful day for love?" I opened my mouth but no words came out. How do you even respond to something like that? "Excuse me, this is my property and you can't just turn it into your own personal wedding venue." That seemed too polite. "What the hell, Karen?" seemed too informal. Instead, I just stood there, trying to figure out if this was a nightmare or some elaborate prank my friends had decided to play on me. Karen, sensing my hesitation, waved me over. "Oh, don't be shy. We just thought this farm had such a rustic charm. It's perfect for a wedding, don't you think?" I didn't think. I thought about cows. I thought about my vegetable garden trampled beneath high heels. I thought about the tractors parked where the caterers were setting up tables. And then I thought about Karen's smug little smile. That's when the anger hit. Not a slow burn, not a simmer. It was a full-blown, white-hot rage. And in that moment, I made a decision. I wasn't going to yell, I wasn't going to plead, and I certainly wasn't going to ask nicely. If Karen thought she could waltz onto my property and throw a wedding like she owned the place, she had another thing coming. I backed away slowly, pretending to be calm, while inside my mind was racing. Plans were forming. Ideas that balanced revenge, humor, and a little poetic justice. The kind of plan that would make Karen never, ever forget this day. I knew this was just the beginning. A storm was coming, and I wasn't planning to be the one drenched. As the music thumped and the guests laughed, completely oblivious, I realized something. This wasn't just about a wedding. This was about respect. This was about boundaries. And most importantly, this was about teaching Karen, once and for all, that my farm wasn't her playground. And I had just woken up to chaos. I marched across my farm, each step crunching on gravel, my heart thundering louder than the wedding music. Karen didn't even flinch when she saw me approaching, which only made my blood boil hotter. She was standing there, arms crossed, her sunglasses reflecting the chaos she had unleashed on my property, like some sort of villain from a low-budget soap opera. "Good morning again," she chirped, her voice way too cheerful for the situation. "Aren't you going to join the festivities?" "Festivities," I barked, finally finding my voice. "Karen, this is my property, my farm, my land. How can you just throw a wedding here without asking me?" She tilted her head, flashing that smirk that made you want to throttle her and apologize at the same time. "Oh, don't be so dramatic. It's just a little wedding. We're celebrating love, community, and beautiful landscapes. Isn't that what you want for your neighbors?" I blinked. Did she just lecture me on community spirit while taking over my farm? My jaw almost hit the hay bale I was leaning against. "Community spirit," I said, my voice trembling with a mix of disbelief and fury. "You mean trampling my fields, shoving tables over my garden, and turning my barn into a photo backdrop for people you barely know?" Karen waved a dismissive hand, like I was a pesky fly buzzing around her fancy little wedding. "Oh, please, you exaggerate. Your farm has so much charm, it was practically begging for a wedding." I could feel my hands trembling, not with fear but with the urge to do something, anything to stop this madness. My brain was already spinning, calculating all the ways I could reclaim my farm without ending up in some HOA lawsuit nightmare. But first, I had to let her know, without subtlety, how insane this was. "You think charm gives you the right to invade someone's property?" I shouted, stepping closer. "This is my farm. I plant the crops, feed the animals, and I decide what happens here." Karen tilted her head even more, a dramatic pose worthy of a magazine cover. "Oh, come on, don't be so uptight. A little fun never hurt anyone. Look at the guests, they're enjoying themselves. Isn't that what life's about?" I took a deep breath, trying to contain my rage. Every fiber of my being wanted to explode, but I knew that losing my temper here might not stop her. I had to be smart. I had to make her understand, through action, not words, that my farm was mine. "And you think this is okay?" I said, gesturing at the chaos around us. The tents, the floral arrangements, the people wandering through my barnyard like it was Disneyland. "You just waltz onto my land, set up your perfect little wedding, and act like I'm the problem." Karen laughed, that smug, echoing laugh that made me want to throw a bale of hay at her head. "Problem? Oh, sweetie, no, you just need to loosen up. Life's too short to fuss over property lines. Look at everyone smiling. Don't you want to be part of the happiness?" I felt my patience snap. Not a quiet snap, but a full-on, chainsaw-through-cake kind of snap. "No, Karen, I don't want to be part of your happiness. I want my farm back, every inch of it. And I will do whatever it takes to make sure this ridiculous wedding ends on my terms." Her smile faltered slightly, just for a second, but I saw it. That little crack in her perfect armor. I knew she was realizing that this wasn't just some passive neighbor complaining. This was someone who cared about their land, and I was not going to back down. She straightened, pretending confidence, but there was a flicker of concern in her eyes. "Well, you could always try to be polite about it." Polite, sure, because politeness would magically make all the chairs and champagne disappear. That's when it hit me. Talking wasn't enough. Lectures weren't enough. The only language Karen understood was, well, a little poetic justice. I turned on my heel, walked back toward my barn, and started plotting. I didn't know all the details yet, but I knew this. Karen had overstepped, and my farm wasn't going to let her get away with it. As I walked, I looked back at the wedding. Karen was busy directing photographers, oblivious to the storm brewing in my mind. And that's when I smiled. Because revenge wasn't just an option anymore, it was inevitable. The audience should feel the tension, the humor, and the anticipation here. The confrontation ends with suspense. Karen thinks she's in control, but little does she know, the real chaos is just beginning. Back in my barn, I leaned against the workbench, staring at the cows as if they might whisper the perfect plan to me. Normally, they were peaceful, slow-moving creatures, content to chew cud and nap under the sun. But today, they seemed to sense my agitation. Maybe they knew that Karen had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. I paced the barn, hands running through my hair. Ideas were bouncing around in my head faster than a goat on a trampoline. At first, I thought about calling the HOA, filing complaints, maybe even involving the police. But that felt too slow, too bureaucratic. Karen wouldn't care until she was personally embarrassed. And if there's one thing she couldn't handle, it was losing control in front of an audience. So I started thinking creatively. I scanned the barn, Bales of hay stacked neatly along the walls, buckets hanging on hooks, piles of manure ready to fertilize my fields. And then it hit me. The perfect combination of resources, timing, and poetic justice. I could make Karen's dream wedding memorable. Not in the way she intended, not in her glossy, Instagram-perfect way, but memorable enough that she would never forget the day she thought she could boss me around. I sat down on an overturned bucket, scribbling ideas on a piece of scrap cardboard. Each plan had its pros and cons. A small prank could work, but I needed maximum impact without crossing legal lines. I wanted her guests to be confused, flustered, maybe even a little horrified, but no arrests, no lawsuits, just a giant lesson learned moment. The more I thought about it, the clearer it became. It was simple, farm-approved, and entirely Karen-proof. It involved my cows, their favorite hangout spots, and well, let's just say the natural byproduct of their presence. I chuckled at the absurdity. Me sneaking around a wedding with buckets of cow manure. It sounded ridiculous, hilarious, perfect, and yet in my mind it felt like justice. I started running through the logistics. Timing was everything. I'd need to move carefully, under the cover of whatever distractions Karen was creating, photographers, caterers, flower arrangements. I'd need to spread the impact across the main wedding areas, the aisle, the reception tent, maybe even the barn where they'd set up for the cocktail hour. It had to be dramatic, unmistakable, and above all, messy. The suspense was thrilling. I imagined Karen noticing, trying to salvage the wedding, her face a mix of horror and disbelief. Guests' reactions would be priceless. Some would laugh, some would cry, some would flee. And all the while, I'd be watching, calm, collected, victorious. I took a deep breath. Of course, I had to be careful. One wrong move and I'd be the one in trouble. But that only made the plan more exciting. My farm was my kingdom, and Karen had just stormed the castle. It was time to remind her who really ruled the land. I glanced at my cows again, nodding to myself. They were on board. Well, maybe not literally, but in spirit. They were my allies, unwitting partners in a perfectly orchestrated prank that would go down in HOA history. By the end of the evening, I had a clear blueprint. Buckets positioned, pathways mapped, timing down to the minute. I could almost see it in my mind. The aisle transformed into chaos, the reception turning into a cautionary tale, and Karen standing in the middle of it all, realizing that she had underestimated me. And yet, as exciting as it was, there was a tension I couldn't shake. Would it work? Would I get caught? Could Karen somehow turn this back on me? The suspense gnawed at me, mixing with anticipation and a strange sense of satisfaction. Finally, I smiled, a slow, confident smile. It was risky, messy, and absolutely hilarious. And it was perfect. Karen had thrown a wedding on my farm without asking. I was about to return the favor in a way she would never forget. Little did she know, the real event was just about to begin. And I was ready. Night fell over the farm, casting long shadows across the fields. The wedding lights twinkled in the distance, and I could hear faint laughter and the soft clinking of glasses. It was the perfect cover for my little operation. I wiped my hands on my jeans, took a deep breath, and mentally prepared myself for the task ahead. Tonight, my farm would reclaim its dignity. I grabbed a few buckets from the barn, each one filled with my not-so-secret weapon. Fresh cow manure, warm and fragrant, ready to deliver the poetic justice Karen so richly deserved. I laughed quietly to myself at the absurdity of it. Here I was, sneaking around my own property like some sort of vigilante, armed with nothing more than farm tools and a sense of righteous indignation. The first challenge was logistics. The main wedding area was massive, rows of chairs lined up perfectly, a pristine aisle stretching to the floral arch, and tables with white linens that hadn't seen dirt in months. One wrong move, and I'd ruin my own plan or get caught by Karen or one of her guests. I crept through the shadows, planning my route carefully, my heart racing with anticipation. As I moved, I encountered my first obstacle. Bessie, my largest cow, who had apparently decided that tonight was the perfect time for a midnight stroll. She was standing directly in the path I needed to take, snorting and flicking her tail like she owned the place. I froze, wondering if I should try to move her or risk slipping past without waking her. One wrong step, and she might trample the buckets or me. After a tense moment, I gently coaxed her toward the barn with a trail of hay, whispering apologies, as if she understood the urgency. Once Bessie was settled, I surveyed the rest of the farm. Every tent, every table, every delicate decoration had to be accounted for. The reception tent was the trickiest, hundreds of guests, waiters moving about, and Karen herself flitting between groups, clipboard in hand. Timing was critical. I had to wait for the perfect moment when the chaos of the wedding itself would mask my little adventure. I moved like a shadow, slipping between the rows of chairs and under the tent flaps. The smell of manure in the buckets was strong, but I focused on the bigger picture. The look on Karen's face when she realized her perfect wedding had been invaded by the one thing she despised most: my farm, my rules, and of course, a little natural fertilizer. Even as I worked, my mind raced. What if someone saw me? What if Karen caught me in the act? The suspense gnawed at me, but it only made the thrill more intoxicating. Every step I took, every bucket I positioned, was a tiny victory. I could almost hear the collective gasp of the guests, the murmur of confusion as the chaos unfolded. At one point, a photographer wandered suspiciously close. I froze behind a hay bale, heart pounding, waiting for him to move along. Minutes felt like hours. Finally, he wandered off, snapping pictures of the floral arrangements, oblivious to the storm brewing beneath his feet. I exhaled quietly and continued. By the time I finished the first section of the aisle, the plan was in motion. Buckets were carefully placed, manure distributed strategically, and pathways mapped for maximum effect. I even set up small traps in the barn where the cocktail hour was planned, ensuring that Karen would face a surprise no one could anticipate. The suspense was unbearable, but in a good way. Every detail was perfect, and the payoff was going to be spectacular. I paused for a moment, leaning on a bale of hay, surveying my handiwork. The farm was quiet now, the wedding still oblivious to what was coming. The tension was electric. I could feel it in the air, in the soft rustle of leaves, in the distant music that mocked me with its cheerfulness. Finally, I allowed myself a small smile. Tomorrow, Karen's wedding would be unforgettable. Not because of love or flowers or perfectly aligned chairs, but because she had forgotten one simple rule: you don't mess with someone's farm. I retreated to the barn, leaving everything in place, ready to execute the final act when the time came. The suspense was nearly unbearable. Every noise outside made me flinch. Every shadow could be Karen discovering my work. But I was ready. The stage was set, the audience unsuspecting, and the farm about to reclaim its honor. And as I settled in for the night, I couldn't help but chuckle. Karen thought she was in control. She had no idea that by morning, her dream wedding would turn into a farm-fueled nightmare. The next morning, the farm was alive with laughter, music, and the soft clinking of glasses. Karen was floating around like a queen in her kingdom, completely oblivious to what was about to happen. I stayed hidden near the barn, heart racing, clutching my first bucket. Today wasn't just about revenge, it was about reclaiming my farm, one strategically timed splash at a time. I waited for the perfect moment, watching the wedding unfold. The bride and groom were posing for photos at the floral arch, guests were sipping mimosas, and Karen was giving instructions to the caterers, clipboard in hand. The scene was idyllic, almost surreal, and almost too perfect for the chaos I was about to unleash. I crept forward, each step measured, careful not to make a sound. The smell from the buckets was overwhelming, but it fueled my excitement. This wasn't just a prank, it was art. Carefully, I positioned the first bucket along the aisle. I imagined Karen's face when she noticed. Would she scream, run, collapse in disbelief? The suspense was intoxicating. The first placement was a success. I moved to the reception tent, ducking behind decorations and tables, careful not to attract attention. A waiter passed by, carrying a tray of champagne. My heart skipped a beat. One wrong move and it would all be over. But luck, or maybe skill, was on my side. I managed to position the next few buckets in prime locations, where any misstep from a guest would lead to maximum effect. By now, the adrenaline was coursing through me. Every sound, the laughter of guests, the music, the soft wind rustling the flowers added tension. I was in sync with the farm, moving like a shadow, invisible yet impactful. My inner monologue was a mix of fear, excitement, and wicked delight. This is going to be unforgettable, I thought. Karen will never recover from this. Then came the barn. The cocktail hour was set up inside, and it was the perfect stage for the final act. I crept inside, careful not to disturb the tables or decorations until the right moment. Guests were milling about, unaware of the impending surprise. I positioned my final buckets strategically along the paths, imagining the chaos that would ensue when someone unknowingly stepped into my farm-fueled masterpiece. Just as I finished, I paused to observe. Karen was now orchestrating a group photo, pointing this way and that, completely unaware that her kingdom was about to crumble. I felt a surge of anticipation and a tiny bit of guilt, but not enough to stop me. Revenge, after all, required commitment. And then it began. The first guest stepped on a hidden spot I had prepared. There was a soft squelch, a surprised yelp, and suddenly the first signs of chaos appeared. Guests looked down in horror or amusement at the unexpected mess. I stifled a laugh, ducking behind a hay bale as the tension in the air thickened. One by one, more people discovered the strategically placed surprises. Chairs wobbled, tablecloths were stained, and guests tried desperately to navigate the paths I had designed with painstaking care. The music continued, oblivious, adding a surreal soundtrack to the unfolding disaster. Karen's expression shifted from confusion to horror, then to full-blown panic. She ran from one side to the other, trying to contain the chaos, shouting instructions that went ignored. Every attempt she made only worsened the situation. Guests were slipping, laughing, pointing, and taking pictures. It was glorious. The wedding had turned into a live-action comedy, and Karen was the unwitting star. I stayed hidden, savoring every second. My adrenaline was still pumping, but a deep satisfaction settled in. This wasn't just about revenge, it was about making a point. My farm was my kingdom, and Karen had just learned the hard way that she didn't get to play queen here. Finally, after what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, I slipped back to the barn to watch from a safe distance. The wedding was in full chaos. Karen was flustered, guests were frustrated, and I was victorious. The suspense had paid off. The plan, executed perfectly, had left no doubt about who really controlled this farm. As I leaned against the barn door, breathing heavily, I couldn't help but chuckle. Karen had thrown a wedding on my farm without permission, thinking she could dictate the day. Now she had a front-row seat to my masterpiece. And the best part, the story was far from over. The fallout would be even more delicious. I watched from behind the barn as the chaos unfolded, and it was better than I could have imagined. Karen's face, which had always carried that smug, untouchable smile, was now a mask of pure horror. Her perfectly styled hair was slightly askew from her frantic movements, and her sunglasses had slid down her nose, revealing eyes wide with disbelief. She looked like she'd just discovered that gravity didn't apply to her perfect little world anymore. The guests were in various states of confusion. Some were laughing nervously, unsure whether to be offended or amused. Others were slipping and sliding across the manure-spotted paths, desperately trying to avoid ruining their shoes or their dignity. One guest let out a loud scream as her heels sank into a particularly strategic pile. I stifled a laugh, pressing a hand over my mouth. The chaos was pure, poetic, and utterly satisfying. Karen, of course, tried to regain control. She sprinted from one end of the aisle to the other, waving her arms like a conductor of a symphony gone wrong. "Stop! Everyone stay calm," she shouted, her voice breaking in a way I didn't think was possible for someone so self-assured. Her attempts only made things worse. Guests collided, chairs tipped, and the flower arrangements I had ignored as collateral damage now looked like modern art in an avant-garde museum. I noticed the bride and groom frozen at the floral arch, the groom trying to sweep petals off the aisle, only to step into another pile I had placed earlier. The bride's expression was priceless, a mix of shock, disgust, and reluctant amusement. I could almost hear her thoughts. Did I really just pay thousands of dollars for this? Karen's panic escalated with each passing minute. She was running back and forth, trying to direct the caterers, photographers, and guests, all while slipping on the manure-slicked paths herself. Every step she took seemed to land her in another mess. My heart raced with excitement. The suspense was electric. Would she finally give up? Would she explode in a way that would make this story even more unforgettable? The photographer, previously so composed, was now attempting to take pictures of the disaster, snapping shots of slipping guests, toppled tables, and Karen in mid-scream. I could hear flashes clicking, and I imagined the album she would later receive, proof of my farm's vengeance captured in high resolution. Karen's voice rose in desperation. "Someone call the caterers. Someone stop this. I don't understand. How is this happening?" Her entourage of bridesmaids and friends was equally flustered, trying to salvage glasses, centerpieces, and dignity. It was chaos on a cinematic scale, and I could barely contain my laughter. Then came my favorite moment. Karen, in her final act of authority, stomped her foot, attempting to summon order. Instead, she slipped slightly, landing with a soft squelch in a carefully placed spot I had prepared. She froze for a second, eyes wide, mouth open, before regaining her balance with a glare. That's when I knew I had achieved absolute victory. I leaned against the barn door, trying to calm my racing heart. The farm smelled like justice. The guests were bewildered. And Karen had officially lost control. I couldn't help but revel in the perfect timing and precision of every placement, every carefully calculated step. Of course, I wasn't completely free of tension. Karen was known for her relentless pursuit of grievances. Could she try to turn this into a lawsuit? Could she call the HOA, the police, or even the neighbors to report me? I didn't know. But at this moment, none of that mattered. I had won. The prank had reached its full crescendo, and the satisfaction was unparalleled. I allowed myself a small grin as I imagined her future nightmares, recounting the event to friends, neighbors, and the HOA board, all while the smell and the memory of her own clumsiness haunted her. The suspense wasn't over, not entirely, but for now, my farm had the upper hand. I glanced at the chaos one last time before retreating further into the barn. Tomorrow would bring calls, complaints, and maybe a few HOA letters. But tonight was mine. I had protected my farm, reclaimed my space, and taught Karen a lesson she would never forget, all with a few buckets, a little patience, and a whole lot of manure. The stage was set for the aftermath, and I knew the fallout would be just as entertaining as the execution. By Monday morning, the aftermath of the wedding was already making waves. My phone buzzed incessantly, emails piling up faster than hay in the barn. Karen had wasted no time firing off complaints, threats, and passive-aggressive notices to the HOA board, the neighbors, and anyone who might listen. I could almost hear her voice through the screen. "How could this happen? This is unacceptable," the audacity. Neighbors stopped by under the guise of casual visits, but I could tell what they were really thinking. Some smirked knowingly, silently cheering me on. Others shook their heads in disbelief, clearly torn between outrage and amusement. Even the mailman gave me a look that said, "Well, that escalated quickly, and I approve." I opened the first HOA email and was immediately treated to a dramatic lecture about property boundaries, rules, and decorum. Karen's words were precise, formal, and dripping with indignation. Every sentence was punctuated with implied horror at the state of her dream wedding. I chuckled, imagining her packing around her living room, waving a phone like a weapon while drafting each line. Her threats were creative, I'll give her that. She hinted at fines, legal action, and the full force of the HOA's moral authority. But as far as I knew, none of it had any real teeth. My farm was my property, and her power only extended so far. Still, I read every email carefully, savoring the mixture of panic, disbelief, and self-importance. I decided to reply to one of her emails, not with anger, not with confrontation, but with subtle, calm confidence. A few short sentences reminded her that the farm was private property, and that trespassing, even for weddings, wasn't covered under HOA etiquette. I sent it off with a small grin, knowing that my words would probably inflame her further, which honestly only added to the satisfaction. Meanwhile, gossip spread faster than wildfire through the neighborhood. People whispered over fences, texted each other photos of the chaos, and laughed at the story of Karen, the mighty HOA president, brought low by a few buckets of manure and a clever farm owner. I couldn't help but overhear snippets. "Did you see her face? I heard she almost slipped herself." It's going to be the talk of the HOA for months. Despite the satisfaction, I couldn't ignore the tension entirely. Karen was known for her stubbornness. I fully expected her to escalate things, to try something drastic to regain control of her ego. I checked my property lines, reviewed local ordinances, and made sure all my ducks or cows were in a row. This was war of patience, wits, and farmland, and I was prepared. The fallout wasn't all chaos, though. Some guests from the wedding reached out with apologies, confused but not entirely mad. A few even laughed when they realized the absurdity of the situation. That alone was worth it, turning an event meant to be perfect into a story they would never forget, all without anyone getting seriously hurt. Karen, of course, refused to admit defeat. She continued emailing the HOA, copying neighbors, and even trying to get the media involved, though thankfully she failed. Every attempt was met with polite but firm resistance, leaving her red-faced and increasingly frantic. I watched it unfold, sometimes laughing, sometimes shaking my head at the sheer audacity. By the end of the week, it became clear that Karen's influence had limits, and my farm had won a small but important victory. The tension lingered because I knew she might try something else, but for now, the dust, or manure, had settled. The community had witnessed her meltdown, and I had reminded everyone that property rights were not just words on paper. They were enforceable, memorable, and occasionally messy. I sat in the barn, sipping my coffee, feeling a strange mix of triumph and relief. The suspense of the previous days gave way to a quiet satisfaction. The farm was mine again, the battle won, and Karen had finally learned a lesson in humility, whether she wanted to admit it or not. I knew this story wasn't over entirely. Karen would grumble, maybe even plot some sort of ridiculous retaliation. But for now, the immediate crisis was over. The farm had survived, my pride was intact, and the community had gotten one of the most memorable HOA stories in recent memory. And I couldn't help but smile, imagining the stories they'd tell at future HOA meetings. The infamous day when Karen's wedding collided spectacularly with my farm. It was chaos, it was hilarious, and it was justice served, messy, fragrant, and unforgettable. By the end of the week, things had calmed down, though the legend of Karen's disastrous wedding spread like wildfire. Neighbors whispered in the grocery store, exchanged knowing glances across fences, and laughed quietly during HOA meetings. Even the mailman gave me a wink when he delivered a letter from Karen demanding yet another explanation. It was glorious. I sat on my porch, surveying my farm, which smelled faintly of victory and, well, manure. My cows wandered lazily through the fields, completely unaware that they had been co-conspirators in one of the most satisfying acts of petty justice in HOA history. I sipped my coffee, smiling to myself. It wasn't just a cup of caffeine, it was a cup of triumph. Karen, predictably, refused to admit defeat. She continued to send emails filled with outrage and dramatic threats. I read them with a sense of calm amusement, imagining her packing back and forth, waving her hands in the air, and muttering about rules, etiquette, and the sanctity of community spirit. But her power over me or my farm was gone. Completely. The neighborhood, meanwhile, seemed to have a renewed respect for me, or at least a deep appreciation for my cleverness. Some neighbors stopped by just to shake my hand, laugh, or share stories of what they'd heard. One elderly lady from down the street leaned over my fence and said, "You really showed her, didn't you?" I grinned, nodding. "Just a little lesson in farm diplomacy," I replied, and we both laughed. Despite the humor and satisfaction, I took a moment to reflect. This wasn't just about revenge or humor, it was about boundaries. Karen had crossed a line, and the farm was my home, my sanctuary. Standing up for it didn't just protect property lines, it protected peace of mind, autonomy, and a sense of fairness. Sometimes, you had to be creative to defend what was yours. I thought back to the wedding chaos, the slipping guests, the toppled tables, the horrified expressions on Karen's face. Each moment had been perfect in its own way, a testament to careful planning, timing, and a little bit of mischief. The suspense of execution, the adrenaline, the near misses, all of it had led to this moment of pure satisfaction. And yet, there was a lingering curiosity. What would Karen do next? She was persistent, unpredictable, and convinced of her own superiority. But I knew one thing: whatever her next move, she'd have to tread carefully. The farm wasn't just a piece of land. It was a symbol, a statement, and I wasn't planning to back down. Life slowly returned to normal. The grass needed mowing, the cows needed feeding, and the farm had its rhythm back. Yet, whenever I passed the wedding area, now slightly faded and trampled, I couldn't help but smile. It stood as a reminder that courage, creativity, and a touch of humor could solve even the strangest of problems. Karen eventually slinked back into her HOA meetings, still fuming quietly, still trying to assert her authority. But her aura of invincibility was gone. Everyone knew about the farm incident. Everyone knew that Karen had met her match, and that knowledge changed the dynamics in subtle but undeniable ways. I had reclaimed not just my farm, but the narrative itself. As for me, I returned to my daily routines with a sense of contentment. I'd stood my ground, delivered justice in a way that fit my personality, and emerged victorious without anyone seriously hurt or humiliated. Except, of course, Karen, who had orchestrated her own downfall with style and grace. Sitting back on the porch, I watched the sun dip below the horizon, painting the farm in golden light. The cows grazed, the wind whispered through the trees, and the barn stood silently, holding secrets of the chaos from a few days ago. I smiled, feeling a profound satisfaction. This was my farm, my life, and I had defended it in a way that no HOA president, no matter how entitled, could ever forget. In the end, it wasn't just about the prank, the manure, or the ruined wedding. It was about standing up for what's yours, using your brain, and never underestimating the power of a little creativity. Karen had thrown a wedding on my farm without permission, thinking she was in control. And I had turned her arrogance into a story the neighborhood would talk about for years. Victory never smelled so sweet, or so earthy. Every HOA has a story on HOA Headaches. You'll hear the ones they tried to bury. Subscribe today.